Heading to Denmark now.
Hours later.
My first view of Sealand. Here we are on Zealand. Hi, my name's David Lovegrove. I've been a student of the Viking Age and the Old Norse and Icelandic languages for 50 years. As a teenager, I was an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force Air Training Corps, where I used to teach aviation and other subjects. I'm a trained classical artist and I have a Master of Arts degree in visual arts. I've studied the history of cultures from all over the world, from east to west, and my passion is to discover the truth of the so-called myths, to discover paleo-contact and what I call human superpowers, the abilities within humans that are denied by the mainstream, but which I and many others find in the ancient texts and artworks. I'd just like to read an inspirational passage from this great book, The Eden Conspiracy by my friend Paul Wallace. He says, "As we toured the Levant, ancient Sumeria and Babylonia with forays into North America, Greece, Italy, Israel, Egypt, West Africa, Papua New Guinea and my own backyard in Australia, we will discover how religious and civil authorities throughout the ages have distorted the transmission of the Bible in such a way as to conceal vital information concerning who we are as a species and how much we are capable of. Together we will lift the lid on secrets gifted to posterity by our Hebrew ancestors, whose intent was to equip future generations to shape a better human experience. Those lost truths reveal that, as individuals and as societies, we have the capacity for so much more than the later God-orientated translations have taught us to believe." Paul Wallace is a good friend and an inspiration. I greatly admire his thinking and I constantly enjoy listening to his videos and reading his books and his posts. The thing about that little statement is that it's exactly what I'm doing with the Viking Age. I'm looking at the ancient stories that have been treated as myths for 1,000 years, mainly by the Christian West, demonizing the old gods, demonizing folk beliefs, and in the early days, literally destroying temples, artifacts, records, and people. So, like Paul, I want to lift the lid on ancient secrets that have been obscured, and through retranslating from the Old Norse and looking at some other languages, Anglo-Saxon and the old Gaelic, Celtic languages, I want to present to you a different story, a story of strange, amazing goings-on, of flying beings, of giant spacecraft up in space, of people with powers that seem impossible now, of incredible strength, incredible skill and dexterity, strange creatures, and indications of high tech that's really out of place in the normal presentation of our history. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to tales from two books. These two books, in the old days known as Saemunda Edda and Edda Snorra Sturlusonar. These days we tend to call the older one, the Saemunda Edda, we call that the Poetic Edda, because it's the older one and it has a lot more poetry in it. And the Edda Snorra Sturlusonar we usually just call the Prose Edda. And this is the book written by the Icelandic chieftain and I believe heathen or pagan or whatever word you want to use, not Christian, writer and historian who preserved for us a lot of what we know and without whom so many of these treasures wouldn't have been saved. They would have been just lost forever, never to be seen again. In the last episode about the Sky People, I told the amazing story of Völund the Smith, or Wayland the Smith in the Anglo-Saxon stories. I looked at the incredible brooch from Uppakra that I found and looked carefully at the University of Lund Library Museum. And I told you the story of Völund, of how he was captured, how he was cruelly treated, forced to create things for the basically evil king, and then how he created himself a flying machine, and he flew, and he first went and taunted the king and told him what he'd done. And there's something there that I wanted to share with you this time to start this episode off that I realised after I made that episode. It's something, a line in here was niggling in the back of my mind. This line happens when Völund has said, "I'd be well," said Völund, "were I to get on my webbed feet those which Nithuthr's men took from me." Laughing, Völund raised himself aloft. Weeping, Bothvilder went from the island, grieved for her lover's going and her father's wrath. So that was the young lady that he got pregnant, the daughter of the king. So laughing, Völund raised himself aloft on his flying machine, and then it jumps to Nithuthr's palace, and it says, "Outside stands Nithuthr's cunning wife, and she walked in the whole length of the hall, but he," Völund, "had settled in the hall yard to rest." And then he calls out, "Are you awake, Nithuthr, lord of Njarar?" The king comes out, and as I said in that last episode, it appears to me that Völund had some kind of loudspeaking system, because one stage he's talking to the king, but the king's stating, "You're up there near the clouds," but he could still hear Völund. So in his helmet, I think he, in that suit, there was some kind of loudspeaking system. Why not? And the king says, I'm always awake, robbed of will. I sleep scarcely at all since the deaths of my sons. My head is chilled. Your counsels are cold to me. Now this is the interesting thing. He says, "I wish now for this, that I may speak with Völund." So that has been niggling at me, and I thought, well, why did he say that? Why did he say, "I wish now that I may speak with Völund"? Because Völunder's there in front of him, and he knows him well. And then it occurred to me that, as we see in the brooch, Völund had a helmet on and a pressure suit. And the king's basically looking at this machine, this strange character that's appeared in his yard, and he's saying, "I wish I could speak to Völund. I want to find out what's going on." And then he goes straight to, "Tell me this, Völund, wise one of the elves, what happened to my healthy cubs?" So in classic sort of ancient saga style, there's bits missing, but we can tell here that at first he can't tell who he is, which really backs up that brooch. It backs up the artistry of that brooch, that there was this helmet, and it's not Völunder's head, but it's some kind of what we would call a space helmet, a helmet designed to protect the pilot, the astronaut, from all sorts of dangers, high-speed wind as they're flying, the perils of vacuum, which will instantly kill you, micrometeorites even. But if you remember when I pointed out that suit, which you can see on the screen now, it's got concentric rings. And that's also been bugging me a little bit. I thought, there's something about this. It looks like a space suit, but why the rings? Why the rings? And then it just hit me last night that ring design is a really elegant and well-known solution for a pressure suit that's pressurized from the inside. So a suit that's providing air, warmth, it's pressurized from the inside so it doesn't flatten on the body of the astronaut. So the suit has to be pressurized to keep that vacuum away. And the rings provide the perfect strength. Those multiple rings are rings the strongest structure, because forces, doesn't matter where they come, they're all sort of taken up by the whole ring. It's like two arches put together. So there you go. There's two interesting things. The other thing is, as they have this conversation and Völund talks about what he's done to the poor kids of the king in his revenge, in his anger, the king says, You couldn't utter words which would grieve me more, and I would not deny you, Völundr, worse, meaning I'd really like to do worse to you if I could get my hands on you. And then he says, no man is so tall that he might take you from a horse. That's an odd thing to say, isn't it? Because he's not on a horse. He's in something that to an ancient person would look like a bird. But he says, no man is so tall that he might take you from a horse. In the next line he says, nor so strong that he may shoot you from below, there where you hover up near the clouds. So we've got two different ideas. The first thing he says, no one so tall he could take you from that horse that you're on. This is after Völund's gone up. So it's a little bit out of order, but the next line says, laughing Völundr raised himself aloft, and unhappy Nithothr sat behind then. The king is saying to him, I'd like to, no man could actually get you off that means of transport. And this is one of the interesting stories in a whole lot of horse stories that I've been finding. Anybody who knows Norse myth knows that Odin had an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir, and there's a whole list of horses. And I'm not going to talk about the horses in this episode. It'll be the next episode I'm going to get right into the whole horse thing. But I just want to say here that I believe the word horse, like many other words, is translated literally as they wrote it, but the meaning doesn't really mean a flying horse. I really don't think they mean a flesh and blood horse, however weird and magical and freaky, is flying with this guy or flying with these other gods. I see it as horse having the same meaning that the American Indians used when they said that's the iron horse, talking about the first steam trains they saw. When you think about a steam train, it really doesn't look like a horse, does it? There's nothing horse-like about a steam train. It's big and huge and black and blows great billows of smoke and steam and makes squealing noises, and it's just not a horse. But obviously for those Indian people who first saw it, the only means of transport they knew, something that could move fast and faster than a man and carry huge loads, was a horse. So the word means essentially an iron means of transport. And I think that that's what's going on in the old Eddas and sagas when they talk about these gods flying through the air on horses. And there is an instance of a boar too. That's a very interesting one. They're literally meaning a means of transport, not a literal horse. So first I'm going to tell you a flying tale that I find really incredible. And this is a translation from this terrific old book, which is called Gods of the North by Brian Branston. And all of my books here are classic books that scholars have used for many decades. And I try to read as many translations as I can. I try to see what others have translated something as. And I also am extremely lucky that I've got a friend in Professor Ármann Jakobsson from the University of Iceland, who's the greatest authority on this subject, I think. Well, there's a couple of others, but, he's pretty special for me. And I can pitch things to him because he's a native Icelander and an expert, and he can tell me if I'm on the wrong track. This particular one, he told me something pretty cool. He confirmed something pretty cool. So this is about, in the book called Gylfaginning, where the wizard king of Sweden, Gylfi, who I've told you about a bit, but you'll hear more about him, he goes to Asgard to seek out the gods because he's had a whole lot of his land ripped off by this beautiful goddess Gefjon, who's taken all this land out of Sweden and plonked it in the sea in Denmark to make Sealand, which is Zealand, and that's what you see at the start of the video, that my flying, and I say, oh, here I am seeing Sealand for the first time, and then I land in Sealand. So he's the king that came from there, and this story is where the wizard king Gylfi's talking to these three people that he considers gods, who are sitting on thrones one above each other, calling themselves high, just as high, and third. And they're sitting on these three thrones, which to me sound like command seats. You imagine Star Trek with the captain and different people sitting on different levels. So he's brought before these flying beings in their ship, Asgard, basically, which I think was a giant ship, and there's going to be a video about that. He's asking them questions and they're answering him, and they sort of tell him, you better be smart in your questions, otherwise there'll be a penalty, and he gets away with it. But essentially, he's come to this point where he's asking them about the goddesses, who are called the Aesir, and they list the different goddesses, and they get to number 14, and they say the 14th is Gnau. Frigg sends her to the various worlds to do her errands. She has a horse called Hofvarpnir. Hofvarpnir translates that name as Hoofwalloper, which scalps over the sky and sea. Once upon a time, some of the Vanir saw her riding through the air, and one cried, "Hey, what flew there? What fizzed away clearing the tops of the clouds?" She replied, this is Gnau, who's fizzing away clearing the tops of the clouds. She says, "I'm not flying, though I fizz away clearing the tops of the clouds. Hofvarpnir's my mount, by Hamskerpir, got out of Garth Rofa." So this just blows my mind. Firstly, she's seen by the Vanir, and my theory, which is quickly growing stronger, is that the civilization of Lake Van, which my friend Paul Wallace and Matthew Lacroix and team investigating this month in October, over in Turkey, the place of Lake Van, those people there, I think they could be the Vanir that are talked about in Snorri's stories. And the Aesir, who are the gods of the Vikings, so-called, Snorri tells us that they come from Troy and that area. Not just Troy, but that they have holdings all around that area. And I think it's actually quite reasonable to think that this could be the story of the people from Lake Van, the Vanir, and their rivalry with the Aesir. So I find it quite incredible that the saga says, "Hey, what flew there? What fizzed away clearing the tops of the clouds?" And the fact that she replies, which once again sounds like a loudspeaker, because they see her fizzing away above the clouds, and next thing she's talking to these people who we assume are on the ground, otherwise they wouldn't be saying, "What's that up there?" If they were flying themselves, they'd know that that's a flying craft of the other side, of one of the Aesir goddesses, or, the eternal, beautiful, radiant women. And perhaps a Valkyrie. That's another thing that's coming to me, that perhaps Valkyries are really one and the same with the Aesir, the women of the Aesir, so-called gods, but really just powerful ones, Elohim. So this brings us to what she says about her mount. Hofvarpnir's my mount, right? Which means a horse. But let's have a look at the Norse and see what that says. Does it say horse? In the Old Norse it says, Honsvara, she swore, or she said, Njejek flyger, tho jek ferk, og at lopti lithk, á hofvarpni, þeim ham skerpir gat við gath rofu. So, that doesn't say horse. The translator has thrown that word in my mount, which is fair enough, but it's not saying a horse. And everyone always assumes it's a horse because, we have this word, or this translation, hoofwalloper, and that this was from what sounds like horses' names, Ham Skerpir Gat with Gath Rofu. Ham Skerpir got from Gath Rofu, which is the way we still speak about horses, being got from, the sire of, that sort of thing. So, this is where it gets interesting, even though it's really interesting already. I wrote to Professor Jakobsson at the University of Iceland, and I put this to him. So this was my email on the 19th of September. Hey Ármann, very sorry to bother you, but only you could solve these questions for me. So the first question I asked was, just making a video about flying in the Eddas. In chapter 35 of Gylfi concerning Gnau, I was wondering about the meaning of Hamskerpir, parent of Hofvarpni. It seems it's unknown, which I'd read, that the translation is unknown what the meaning of Hamskerpir is. And then I said, could it be something like Ham, meaning shape? Remember that from the last video? Hammer, like Arnahammer or Valshammer, Alptahammer, the eagle shape, hawk shape, swan shape, and Skerpir, equaling perhaps sharp or shaper. So Ármann wrote back to me, "Hi, names of course tend to have an unsure meaning, but what you think, shape and sharp, makes perfect sense. Yours, Ármann." So I was thrilled about that. To have this confirmation from the real professor really made my day. So if we think about it now, Hofvarpnirs is the name of Gnar's horse that she's flying on, or the mount. Bringing in my other reasoning, so it's not a horse, it's something that she's flying on, and I believe it's some kind of flying craft. She's fizzing away, and I love this translation because others just say that what travels there in the sky, but Branson considers that it's strong enough meaning to say fizz, which sounds like, I've got my kids to say, what fizzes, what's a fizzing thing? And they all came up with something like a jet, or, soda, soft drink fizzing in a bottle, but that's the sound, isn't it? That's a fizzing sound, and that's the sound of a jet, plus the rumble and the roar. But we don't know what these really were, whether they were the type of air-breathing jets we think of or some other technology, but it was making a fizzing noise, and it was fizzing along, meaning going very quick. So Hofvarpnir translated as hoofwalloper, but it could also be hoof striker, and if it's not really a horse, then it could be something else. It could be a gunship. It could be, taking a little bit of a stretch, but war horses, for those who've never faced them, they are actually a weapon. They're not only great big solid things carrying usually a big man with a sword or a lance or whatever, but the horses are trained to strike with their hooves, boom, 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 like that. They fight. They naturally fight to protect themselves and undoubtedly protect their rider. So a hoofwalloper, that could easily be, it's a way of saying the means of transport, the horse, has its own weaponry. It can strike. This Hofvarpnir has been bred or made by Sharp Shape, got out of Garth Rofa. So after seeing the exciting Völund brooch, the next cabinet held these treasures. You can see there's multiple of these supposed birds. They're considered cultic figures, some kind of bird worship, perhaps something perhaps to do with Odin's ravens. But personally, I look at them and they all look like depictions of flying craft. This particular bird really took my attention because there's something mechanical about it. If you look at those wings, they really are sharp shapes, aren't they? They look pretty much like an F-111 or other swing-wing aircraft, fighter aircraft of the modern era. When you have a look at that head, it really does look like a cockpit, a dual-seater cockpit. There's something about that piece down the centre that just looks like a piston or some kind of mechanical vent. Perhaps that's the rocket. Perhaps that's the jet. When the wings are swung out, that's where the thrust comes out. And this is exactly what ancient people who are hiding in a forest watching, somewhat terrified, as these flying gods flew around in these objects, and maybe they sneaked up by stealth like some kind of lost tribe from the Amazon, unseen, and watched the airfield and saw these things. they would look at that and they'd remember the sharp shapes. They'd remember the aerodynamic outlines of these things. And to say that they came from hamskerpir, sharp shape, as I translated it with the confirmation of Professor Jakobsson, that sort of makes sense.
What immediately struck me when I looked at these flying bird-shaped objects was how many of them had faces on their backs. Now, of course, this could be just some representation of a god's face, maybe Odin, maybe these are considered to be ravens. But it also could be indicating that there was a pilot, that there was a presence of a being somehow connected with these bird shapes. And that's how I like to think it could be. I think ancient peoples had languages that were pre-literate, but they were just as powerful if you could read them. Having spent years as a teacher of visual literacy, I've learnt how much the old saying, a picture tells 1,000 words, is true. Just because people didn't have text, because they didn't write in a script, doesn't mean they didn't have a form of writing. And so much ancient sculpture, so much ancient rock carving, and other types of carving and art are not just for decoration, but they're telling us a story, and it's there for us to interpret. We may well have forgotten what the original meanings were. Maybe the people who understood the meanings have been gone for 1,000 years, but with intelligence and with the great clues we have in the Eddas from Iceland, with rune stones, with other stories connected to these ancient northern stories, then we can work a lot out. And I really think that these bird shapes are representing a cultural memory of flying beings that fizz through the sky, way up high, coming down low, perhaps even travelling in space, being seen very high up, just as lights maybe coming down, appearing. I think this is a very exciting time and a very exciting subject.